Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar today on everything you wanted to know about outcomes funds, but were too afraid to ask. We are going to give people a couple more minutes to log in, and then we will be kicking off. So just give us a few minutes. Let's let everybody join us, and then we'll start. Great. Thank you so much for those of you that are introducing yourselves. It's great to have you here with us today. I think it's about that time for us to get the conversation started. So I want to start us off with just a quick note that we've all had that experience where we have bought something that didn't turn out to be what we had expected to have bought, right? You've all had that buyer's remorse or that frustration when you've spent money on something and it didn't deliver the outcome that you were hoping for. Now, while it's frustrating for us as individuals when we have that experience, it is incredibly damaging when that experience is felt by the public sector, by philanthropies, or by investors who are directing large sums of money towards achieving particular outcomes that are then not achieved. So when we're looking at it on that scale, it becomes almost dangerous. What we're talking about today are outcomes funds, which is one particular method that's been designed in an effort to prevent this kind of buyer's remorse at scale. And it's really around creating a marketplace for outcomes and making sure you get the bang for your buck when you're looking for a particular kind of real world impact. I'm very pleased to be joined today by representatives of all these facets. So we have representatives from public sector, from philanthropy, and from the practical implementation side to talk to you a little bit more about what this model looks like and how it works, not just in theory, but also in practice. What we'd like to do just to get things started is we'll have each of the speakers, and they've prepared 1 or 2 slides each. They're going to give you a bit of background from their perspective and their experience with the funds. And once we've done that, we'll have a lot of time left over for a bit of a panel discussion and some questions and answers from the audience. Now, the true value of these discussions is always in the conversation that we have. So please do feel free to use the chat and the Q&A to send through questions. You can direct it to a particular speaker, or you can ask general questions, and we'll try and get through as many of those today as we can. A reminder that your questions will need to come through in that way. We can always unmute you if it's something that you absolutely have to ask verbally, and in that case, you can let us know in the chat that that's something you would like to do. For now, though, I think it's always good to begin at the beginning. So I'd like to hand over to Stuart Theobald, who is the founder and the chair of Crutham, to talk us through the basics and the principles that underpin these vehicles. Stuart, it's over to you.
Afternoon, everybody. Great to be with you. Thank you, Nicole. Hopefully you are seeing a slide that I am sharing now. What I'm going to do is run through some very high-level conceptual framework around outcomes funds and what they are. I'm going to be followed by Riyad, who's going to give you a much more hands-on practical example of the Jobs Boost Fund, which he can work through. But let's start at the beginning. What do we mean when we talk about outcomes? So when you go off and typically acquire something, let's say you're out to buy some pizza, you would go straight to the outcome, the pizza that you want to consume, and you would consume it because you expect it to have some impact, like satisfying your hunger. You don't really worry about the inputs and activities that go into that producing that pizza. You're just interested in the outcome. But when we do typical public or development objectives, we tend to focus our spending the other way around. So it really goes into the inputs and activities. From a public sector point of view, you might be funding training programs, educational institution, you might be procuring things, you might be providing tax incentives, and your sort of hope that you're going to get to the outcome you want, which is jobs. But your money is all going into the inputs and activities. So an outcomes fund really turns this around and turns the driving the outcome that you want a bit more like standard consumption of goods and services that we would buy in our everyday lives. And there's a real sort of logic to that. So we are shifting the spending out of the traditional areas, which is the inputs, activities, to the outcome. And that's where we're focusing what triggers payments. When you are focused on inputs and activities, have a theory of change, right? You anticipate that by spending, by supporting programs, it's going to lead to some anticipated change in the world. But the implementation risk really sits with you in the public sector in making sure that those outcomes come about. An outcomes fund shifts the risks, and this is a very important economic effect of the outcomes fund. Your implementation risk shifts over to the private sector or the voluntary sector, where you form implementation partnerships, and those implementers deliver the outcomes to you. So the economics of this really shift. What you're doing is setting up a dedicated pool of funding to pay for social outcomes directly instead of programs that are about the inputs and activities. You can be agnostic about the inputs activity. So you say you're paying for a specific outcome, and you can define that outcome in many ways. So we've used the example of employment, and Riyadh will talk about one particular application of employment. But outcomes funds have been applied in many different fields. You can use them in early childhood development, in education. You can even use them in environmental objectives, wildlife objectives, and so on. As long as an outcome can be defined and measured and verified, an outcomes fund can work. Why does it matter? What good does it do? So it creates a lot of incentives. Number one is that it encourages innovation. When we don't try and centrally plan what the input should be, you're enabling organizations to develop new ways of achieving those outcomes. It frees them up to innovate, develop new technology to reduce the costs of achieving those outcomes. It also encourages partnerships. When you focus on outputs, you incentivize groups to find those partners who are most able to collaborate with them to achieve the outcomes. You don't get the same kind of territorialism that you do when you're funding inputs and an organization wants to straddle the full value chain to maximize their revenue. You are also driving efficient resource allocation. So you're supporting organizations to think about really achieving the outcomes at the lowest costs, rather than focusing on inputs and processes where they're generating fees simply by undertaking some or other activity. You're also really encouraging transparency and accountability. Those outcomes are measurable, they're definable, it's absolutely clear when spending is achieving its intended results. Outcomes funds can also be scalable. So you might set up a fund and you can then use it to crowd in additional funders. So a set of programs and activities might absorb a certain budget. Reallocating that budget to a fund allows you to establish a pool that others can join in. And it also improves the risk management. So you're taking the risk of outcomes failures, you're shifting it onto the people actually running programs and delivering those outcomes. So you're reducing the probability of outcomes failures. You're making sure you're getting what you're paying for, as Nicole put it. I won't run through the standard model because it'll make more sense for you to see this when Riyadh talks through a real example. But let me just touch on the pros and cons of the outcomes approach. So I've talked about the lower risk to the funder. It's much less prescriptive. Implementers know what to do. They can innovate, clearly defined and predictable outcomes. You're giving the implementers greater independence, and you have greater transparency and authenticity in the outcomes you're achieving. The disadvantages: it does create cash flow challenges for the implementer. They are obviously striving to deliver outcomes, and they only receive their cash payment at the end of the process. So there can be questions about the working capital that enables the implementation partner to conduct the programs that generate the outcomes. There's definitely higher risk on the implementer. The implementer loses out if they fail to deliver the outcomes. And that risk has to be able to be managed by them. Generally, the economics suggest that you want to put the risks in the hands of those best able to manage them. And we think implementers in a good outcomes fund are the ones who are best able to manage them. There can be a higher administrative burden because you've got to run the fund and the program, and there can be complexity and costs in contracting. But and I think we can talk more about this in discussion. The complexity and costs have definitely been reducing as these projects have been done. Experience has built up, lots of templates have built up, and it's now becoming much cheaper to implement them and to run them. You do have data verification requirements. Someone has to verify that outcomes have actually been achieved. But I think you generally find that in most programs, you're running your implementation measurement as well, which carries its own costs. There can be rigidity around definitions and acceptable outcomes. And this is an area that can make outcomes funds unsuitable in circumstances where it's very hard to define the outcome. So in some areas, for instance, in social work, where you're working with communities where it's very hard to define what the specific achievements should be, it's rather about supporting things widely without being prescriptive about what the ends are. You also need some level of economy of scale. So outcomes funds don't work for small and focused projects. A final word just on the future of outcomes fund. So in principle, what you're doing in paying for the pizza instead of the inputs is you're encouraging a marketplace for people to develop outcomes that can then be sold to you. And that can then be built up through public procurement, where you've identified earmarked budgets specifically to pay for those outcomes. Ultimately, and we're seeing some initiatives, particularly in Europe, you might be able to develop outcomes markets. So you can almost think about a typical market where you go and buy something that you want to achieve, and you'll find it listed up in a marketplace, and you can buy it at a set price. There are efforts now to create such markets where you can go in and buy specific social outcomes. It might be employment, it might be various health outcomes that you desire, immunization, for example. Verifiers then issue a certificate that the outcomes have been achieved, and those certificates are made available for sale in a marketplace. And by buying them, you're then providing the cash for the implementer to go out and generate new outcomes, and you create a virtuous circle in that way. We're certainly far from that in South Africa. I think where we are is very much at the beginning of this development, where we're taking traditional procurement in philanthropy and public sector and tooling it to be able to support outcomes funds, and thereby achieving a far greater impact, far greater return for the money being spent, starting to develop a market that is able to generate outcomes, so becoming much better, much more efficient at really getting to the outcomes that then allow the cash to flow. Perhaps in time, as things develop, we'll move further along this kind of trajectory in South Africa, and perhaps some of you on this call will be part of that trajectory. Let me pause there with that quick conceptual overview. We'll certainly be making these slides available for you to look at in over a bit more time in future. Thanks, Nicole.
Thanks very much, Stuart. And I know that you need to drop off in about 15 minutes. So I encourage anyone that's in the audience, if you have a specific question based on what Stuart has said, please do pop it into the Q&A. So maybe he can answer it before he leaves. Otherwise, I'm sure it's something that some of the other speakers will cover. But so now we've had our quick crash course on the basics and the principles, the structure of these outcome funds, how they work. It's great to understand things in principle, but it's better to see how they work in practice. So very excited to hand over to Riyadh, who will give us a bit of an insight into what this looks like in the real world, using an actual example that Kudum is working on. Riyadh, please go for it.
Perfect. Thanks, Nicole. Good afternoon, everyone on the call. I'm going to run very briefly through an example of Jobs Boost Outcomes Fund, and some of the challenges and lessons learned from the program, as well as where we're at the moment. Just broadly, what is Jobs Boost Outcomes Fund? It's a 300 million Rand outcomes fund pilot, and it's supporting the placement of excluded youth into quality jobs. Just a couple of things around it. We're specifically looking at 18 to 34-year-olds being placed into employment. We're looking at quality jobs. So these are jobs that are not internships or stipended in any way, but are fully remunerated by the employing organization at a 12-month contract or open-ended. We're specifically looking at excluded youth. So these are youth that are from a quintile 1, 2, or 3 school, or have been a recipient of a child support grant. And all of the payments in this fund is linked directly to outcomes being achieved. In terms of the structure of this fund, it is following a very standard model. So at the center, we've got the special purpose vehicle, Employment Outcomes Fund, NPC, or Jobs Boost Outcomes Fund. We receive We received technical funding from the Michael and Sue Dell Foundation, and technical assistance for the fund, or the full administration of the fund, is being provided by Grutham, with legal assistance by Bowmans. And the exclusive outcomes funder in this case is the National Skills Fund. We are there. The target is to reach 5,500 unemployed youth beneficiaries, and that's going to be through 12 implementation partners. As Stuart mentioned, in this particular case, we're not involved in any of the bilateral agreements that some investors may have for cash flow assistance to the implementation partners. And we are working with 2 audit firms to verify the outcomes. From where the program started, we received 102 expressions of interest. That filtered down to 12 implementation partners finally being selected. Where we at the moment, our impact to date, and this is the program's only kicked off about 3 months ago. We're currently on just under 3,000 enrollments, which represents about 2/3 of our target as total. And we're looking at over 1,000 placements into employment already. And the nature of this program, it's a very short-term program in the greater scheme of employment. The training component in that ideally needs to fit within 12 months or less, so that we can measure 3 months sustained placement and 6 months sustained placement into jobs. Just on that, the 4 milestones that this program focuses on. The first milestone for payment is enrollment, and organizations get about 20% of the budget on enrollment, verified enrollment. Then there's placement into employment, and about 40% of the budget goes towards that. And then the other 2 milestones are sustained employment at 3 months and sustained employment at 6 months. To date, we've paid out over 5.5 million rand. Actually, I need to update this. It's now about 10 million rand. And there's about 11 different employers that are employing the youth out of the program. Just in terms of the proposals that we received, you'll see that we had a very strong urban representation, even though we did bias our scoring towards rural. And that is part of the lessons learned from this program. Some of the big lessons around launch of an outcomes fund is that market building is absolutely essential. We've got to build up a lot of momentum at the start so that we do get a good kind of auction around the different price points. Formal employment in rural is very difficult, especially in this case where we purposefully excluded any public sector employment. And then we also noticed that the location of our implementation partners does not match the geography of need. And again, that speaks to that, to those rural conditions. And we do need to be very, very clear about all of our outcomes and expectations at the start, and it does need to be very well documented. Since we've been in implementation, some of the lessons we are learning is that there does need to be a very strong focus on evidence quality, and we're seeing a lot of organizations struggling with this, especially with their first payment requests, where organizations are not used to having to quality control their documents and evidence at the level that's required for this. And here we're preparing everything for audit. And so there is a zero tolerance for errors, and organizations are having to fix that multiple times before we get through to payments. We do see that process smoothing out as we go along. Another big lesson learned was we do need a very robust data management system to reduce the risk of human error. And we went through quite a process of getting to this point. But the off-the-shelf solutions don't seem to be particularly appropriate, in particular for this program. Managing expectations is very important, especially in terms of timelines and in terms of expectations of what needs to be verified. A lot of our partners, I think, didn't fully grasp at the start the level of scrutiny that is going to be put onto the data, and didn't expect that every single detail down to ID number matching with contract, matching with proof of address, etc., needs to be on the system, and that has created a few delays. You've got to get it right the first time, and after that we see it generally flowing much faster. And then there's another big issue in this particular context, is the reliability of our job seekers. So the program does unfortunately rely quite heavily on contacting job seekers. And that poses quite a few challenges, especially with the youth group that we're working in, and some of the jobs that they are entering into in the service industry, and that where they sometimes unable to answer their phones, their phone numbers change, and so on. And again, it's something that I think organizations have not been particularly well controlled for at the start. But we are again seeing that improving as we go along. Yeah, and I just wanted to show you a screenshot. Some of the numbers that are coming out of our system, I'm not going to focus on it. It will be in the slides we sent through to you. But this is just to illustrate that one of the key things of this program that we think is one of the potential success factors is the robust data management system that in real time is telling us what our data is looking like. We can toggle between what's verified, what's unverified, what's in the system. And you do need to be able to bring your data to this level in order to monitor the progress across all of the partners. Yeah, that's it from my side. Looking forward to the discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Riyad. And I think it really does make a difference to have a real example to work through. And there always will be a lot to learn, especially when you're pioneering something new. So it's an exciting experiment, and it's great to see that it's yielding some results already. We do have 1 or 2 questions already in the chat. So thank you to everyone who's throwing those together. One of the questions is around the upside risk for the implementer. So Riyad, maybe you can give us some color on what happens if an implementer exceeds their targets? So what if they do even more than they were expected to do? Is there some sort of benefit that they get, or they only get for what they proposed?
So we are not expecting every single implementing partner to knock their targets out of the park. Some organizations are going to be struggling, and some organizations are already exceeding their targets kind of 3 months in. The advantage with this is that organizations that are underperforming against the timelines that we've contracted to, we are able to reallocate or change targets, reduce their targets, and potentially increase the targets of the implementers that are doing well. So there is that upside or that windfall that can be achieved. And also because of the way organizations tended to cost out their program, we are able to scale most of them in a fairly linear fashion without changing the budget, the sort of cost or grant per job, without changing that too drastically.
Thanks very much, Riyad. Stuart, I don't know if in the 4 minutes before you need to jump off, there's an interesting question here around how you choose the focus area. So how do you know which is the outcome that you're after, and how do you know it's not just an input, essentially? Are there some key sort of classification criteria you need to be thinking about when you're choosing your end outcome?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, one could say that in a case like Jobs Boost, employment is the outcome, but actually you only have employment because employment allows you to earn a living, which allows you to live a good life and have a good family life, and you could redefine your outcomes as those. I think it's key to think through the difference between the outcome and the impact. Impact is enabling a salary, enabling somebody to be self-sufficient, and the outcome is the job. It can be a matter of definition over where you want to draw the line. And we've seen in outcomes funds that people would choose some outcomes that we would consider to be more inputs. What really matters is the risk of delivery. So if your policy objective is to create employment, focus on that as the outcome. So go straight to your endpoint of where your policy ambition, or as a philanthropy, where your mission, your purpose is focused. Look at those as the outcomes, and that's what you design the outcomes fund around.
Great, thanks. Wanted to move on to another question, but Farid, for you before we move to Sekho, was just about, can we explain how this is different from other programs like the YES program or ESD programs that companies might have?
So it's quite significantly different from any of the programs that have an internship component. Very critically, this program only looked at jobs that are fully remunerated by the employing entity at minimum wage or higher, and is authentic in the sense that it's not stipended in any way. So that already differs from a lot of other employment creation programs that exist today. Yeah, so that's probably the biggest difference. And the idea is to pilot something where we are, specifically looking at jobs that the organizations have a strong enough demand for that they are fully remunerating for.
Okay, great. That's super helpful. I think there are more questions that are coming in, and we will absolutely try and get to as many of them as we can, but I do want to make sure that we give each of our speakers enough time to chat from their perspective. So I'd like to hand over now to Sekho Walker from the Office of the Presidency to talk a little bit about the public sector perspective. I know when we talk about outcomes funds, we're talking about innovation and new models, and that's not necessarily something you would usually associate with the public sector's risk appetite. So it'd be great to hear a little bit more about the experience from your side.
Thank you, Nicole, and good afternoon, everyone. It really is good to be with you today. As Nicole mentioned, my name is Sekho Walker. I'm the director in the presidency responsible for the Presidential Youth Employment Intervention. I do want to preface my input today by stating up front that I've been in this role for just about a year. So my predecessor, Lerato Shai, really did all the hard work from a government perspective as it relates to getting this fund over the line. I'm just enjoying seeing the fruits of her hard work being implemented. My aim today is to give you a very brief overview of the Presidential Youth Employment Intervention and locate the demand-led skilling component and the Jobs Boost Outcomes Fund in particular within the context of the broader intervention. Then I'll provide an overview of some of the value of outcomes funds to government departments. I'll give a very brief overview of the process to getting to where we are with Jobs Boost, because in that process, we experienced several challenges and learned some really useful lessons that are applicable both to government as well as to the stakeholders who want to work with government on their outcomes-based financing instruments. Okay, so very briefly, the Presidential Youth Employment Intervention was launched by the President in 2020 in response to the youth unemployment crisis in the country. And its primary objective is to transition young people successfully from learning into earning. Given the structural nature of the barriers to youth unemployment and the urgency of the crisis, the President decided to actively coordinate and drive the intervention within the presidency. The PYEI implements 4 components that aim to increase alignment across and beyond government and innovate in ways that accelerate delivery and catalyze further actions. So coordination, innovation, and accelerating delivery within government systems are core to what we do. The demand-led skilling component of the PYEI aims to ensure that young people are equipped with the skills that meet actual demand in the economy. And it's within this context that it was decided to test a pay-for-performance mechanism as a demand-led skilling delivery model. So what is the value of outcomes-based approaches to the public sector in particular? Some of this Stuart already spoke to in his presentation. But the first is that it allows government to crowd in additional funding for service delivery. The severe constraints on the fiscus, and in our case, the huge scale of the youth unemployment problem in the country requires us to get other funders on board. And in the initial negotiations with Treasury, this was one of the main reasons they were excited about the model and allocated funding to the model. Second, and Stuart mentioned this, is that it shifts the financial risk away from government. In traditional public sector funding, government bears the risk for failure. So if the funding for skills development, for example, doesn't lead to jobs, which we know it does happen in this country, taxpayer funds are still spent. And really, this is the selling point, to government, that outcomes funds transfer this risk to the service providers or to investors. So government does not pay for services that fail to deliver. Lastly, and this is an important one, there's flexibility and innovation in service delivery, which we know can be a challenge in government. Because outcomes funds encourage service providers to be more flexible and creative in how they deliver their services, they have the freedom to innovate and adopt new approaches that might be more effective. Great. So the journey to Jobs Boost actually started with its predecessor, the Bonds for Jobs Social Impact Bond. It was piloted in 2018, expanded in 2019, but eventually had an early closure in 2020 due to COVID. When the PYEI was established in 2020, the decision was made to test an outcomes-based mechanism at a national level, building on Bonds for Jobs. And within the skilling space in particular, because of the low returns to investment that we see in the space, DHET and NSF had been involved in the process of establishing the PYEI. So there was buy-in from a political and strategic level. And I say this deliberately because that buy-in wasn't necessarily there at the technical or operational level, and lots of work needed to be done to get that buy-in at that level. But Treasury allocated the outcomes funding, and NSF, the National Skills Fund, and I don't know if everyone knows this, but the National Skills Fund is an entity of the Department of Higher Education and Training. They were tasked by Treasury to match the funds for outcomes funds. The mechanism was designed, and initially it was going to be implemented and managed by the National Skills Fund. An RFP was issued by the National Skills Fund to solicit applications from prospective ecosystem facilitators, but due to a number of factors, that process was unsuccessful. Crutham was then appointed by the National Skills Fund to conduct a rapid assessment of the process, which included recommendations to inform the redesign. The fund was redesigned based on the rapid review. Crutham was appointed to manage Jobs Boost, and implementation started in 2020. This is a very simplistic process, a very simplistic version of the process. And those that were involved would agree to this. And as you can see, it took 3 years from conceptualization and design to actual implementation. So there's a lot of detail within each of these steps that isn't captured on the slide. But the reason I wanted to show this slide is to provide some context to the lessons that we learned on the Jobs Boost journey, especially about a fund where government is so heavily involved. And these lessons are important for any outcomes-based approach or mechanisms that want to have any form of government involvement. These are also lessons that informed the current version of Jobs Boost, and some of these lessons will also inform the scale of Jobs Boost, which we envision will take place in 2026. So the first thing that we must acknowledge if we want to institutionalize these instruments within government in the way that Stuart described is that there is limited capacity from a human resources perspective within the South African civil service. What further exacerbates this challenge is that it's a novel approach, and because of that, there are limited expertise and practical knowledge on these instruments in government. So what this means is three things. One, you need a champion that's going to go to war for you within the government department or the government agency. The pay-for-performance mechanism or the outcomes-based financing approach, it needs to be in their performance agreements. And in our case, it was in the minister's performance agreement with the president. Because if it isn't in the performance agreement, the things that are in the performance agreement will take precedence. And thirdly, and probably most importantly, ongoing capacity building and skills transfer needs to be built into the design of the fund. Linked to that first lesson is that there can be resistance to change, fear of failure, and risk aversion to innovation within government, especially because this approach requires government to fundamentally change the way in which they think about procurement, as well as measuring and accounting for results. So in our case, there was nervousness within the National Skills Fund about how to account for the spend to the Auditor General, because it's something that, the National Skills Fund hadn't done before. So the implication is that ongoing change management needs to happen both at the strategic levels, which we know change often in our country, as well as at the operational levels. And then importantly, also within the broader ecosystem, right? So in our example, like I mentioned, the Auditor General needs to be brought on board around what this means for their accounting processes. The third challenge is, and this is something that we learned the hard way, is that developing and procuring for outcomes within existing government systems is very challenging. And this lesson is specific for my government counterparts who are on the call. I saw someone from the Department of Basic Education is here. Because the readiness of the state to contract based on outcomes really is dependent on making critical shifts in the regulatory and legislative level to provide that clear guidance regarding how to implement these instruments within the ambit of the country's frameworks. And then again, extensive capacity building and changes to standard operating procedures, templates, etc., within the government departments or the government agencies would be required to prepare the organization to make the shift to contracting based on outcomes. In our case, following the failed procurement, like I mentioned, we pivoted to the special purpose vehicle, and Riyadh spoke about it, and that's the vehicle that we are using to contract. And then lastly, there is an absence of a regulatory framework guiding these instruments, which makes the organization's piloting outcomes-based financing approaches really groundbreaking in the true sense of the word. And so as the presidency, I just wanted to sort of end on this. We have established a learning group that is co-chaired by the Treasury. It's quite a new learning group. that brings together the various organizations that are implementing outcomes-based approaches to better understand what the challenges of institutionalizing these instruments are within government. And then, because the presidency is the center of government, we want to lead the development of a legislative framework that addresses the challenges of institutionalization and is enabling to outcomes-based approaches. So yeah, that's it from me. I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks very much, everyone. I mean, it's so good to get this insight. So definitely it's not without its challenges, right? To get involved from a public sector side, but the value is definitely there, and super fantastic to hear that there's work being done to make it possible to have more of these kinds of vehicles in the market. So we'll definitely be watching that with interest. A quick note to everyone that's on the call, we are seeing your questions. We are going to address as many as we can. I just want to assure you of that again. But before we do, I wanted to hand over to Darshan Govender from Dell Foundation to talk a little bit about the role that the foundation played in this and the perspective that they have. Over to you, Darshan.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Nicole. So thanks everyone on the call for joining. And I think I want to kind of start off my section by sharing why we at the foundation saw this opportunity as compelling. So initially, when we had gotten involved in the Jobs Boost program, there was a very clear intent by the presidency and Treasury to test and pilot a model that got funding paid on outcomes. And so having worked as a foundation in the jobs and livelihood space for over a decade, we saw an opportunity for us to be able to go in and use the existing funding that was available by the state to find a way of being able to use that funding in the most appropriate way to pay for outcomes so that more young people can get those quality jobs. And so that additionality was very, very clear. Funding was on the table. And so as a foundation like ourselves, we needed to go in and support in designing the program so that that funding could actually go to implementing partners and ultimately unlock the jobs. So with that, when you think about outcome-based funding and how donors typically view that particular tool, we see 7 reasons as to why this particular tool is compelling. So first, off the bat, I mean, I think what outcomes funding does is that it really gets impact to be front and center. So it's helping organization and it helps us drive the data to really allow us to be able to transparently set benchmarks and understand the cost of achieving impact. So you'll typically see that there's a rate card and there's a cost per job. Each of the providers that have signed up on the Jobs Boost program understand their unit economics very, very clearly. They understand what those drivers of those costs are. And so it really helps us to have a data-driven approach to having impact front and center and understanding what it's going to take from a cost perspective to be able to get us there. The second compelling reason for an outcome-based funding is that the impact per rand. So Stuart and Riyad had spoken about, you're not paying for the input costs up front. You're not basing the funding on milestones. You're truly using the funding to really incentivize the actual delivery of the outcome. And so with that, it brings efficiency to capital. And so that is a compelling reason for donors. The third reason is that it attracts more funding. So you're able to leverage other pools of funding and there's a potential for scale. I think most foundations, even though they have resources, those resources are limited. And so as a donor, you're always wanting to work within the ecosystem and trying to be full capital so that you're able to maximize on impact. And so an outcomes fund allows for you to be able to do that. The next reason, which is number 4, is that you're able to drive outcomes that matter more. And so what that means is that as part of the design process, you're putting together the guardrails or you're putting together the filters that actually encourages the most compelling service providers to bubble up to the top as part of your selection process, so that these are quality providers that can actually deliver on the outcomes. And so that is a way of being able to drive effectiveness in being able to build a model that is scalable. Number 5, I think the outcome-based funding mechanism allows for service providers to be held accountable in providing those delivery of the outcomes, but it also provides them flexibility and the autonomy to be able to access funding in a way that allows them to be able to change their implementation if they need to, pivot, respond to market changes that may be impacting their skilling and their training programs, or relationships and partnerships that may have changed over time. And so the mechanism allows for that flexibility and agility. Number 6, I think it is really a proof point, and it is a way in which other donors are able to watch a pilot like this and potentially align their funding in the future, and adopt strategies like this. So it's kind of allowing for an ecosystem impact where there's a high impact trajectory if other donors in the space are able to leverage models like this in order to be able to truly create new jobs and additional jobs within the sector. And then finally, I think a structure like this is pretty sector agnostic. So it's a tool that can be used whether it's in digital jobs or jobs in agriculture. It's very much kind of a tool that is pretty sector agnostic, obviously taking into account the length of a training program. But it also allows for various other funders to incorporate other aspects of their mandates into the fund. So for example, if you are a donor and you have a rural mandate, or if you have a gender lens, you're able to layer that into the program, so that you're able to meet your mandate as a funder. So from a donor perspective, I think when we're thinking about outcome-based funding tools and how do you leverage that in order to be able to create additional impact within a space, these are the kind of 7 things that bubble up, or 7 aspects that bubble up in terms of how you would position it, and why a donor would see this program as being attractive. So I'll pause there and hand over to Nicole.
Great, thank you so much, Darshan. I think what we are hearing from all these different perspectives is really that the simplest way to describe the outcome fund is that if you are an organization that is tasked with delivering impact, this is a way for you to do that with minimal wastage, right? So for you to make sure that you deliver that impact in the most efficient way possible. And I also think what's come through very strongly is the ability of these vehicles to catalyze innovation, right? So if what we're looking for is to place people into formal employment, you can do that with a program that creates new jobs. You can also do that with a program that places people into existing opportunities. So it's really up to the implementing partners to get to that outcome in whichever way that they see fit. And really, without that prescription from the funder, it gives them a lot more room to be agile and to achieve those outcomes in innovative ways that we might not have thought about. One of the questions that has come through that I thought is quite interesting that we can throw out there, maybe to you, Riyad, to get us started, is what's the role of sort of the corporate sector in creating this market for outcome-based funding, if at all? Where do they fit?
So there's a couple of roles that the corporate sector does play. I think the one is that through their various CSI and social development programs, I think that they can play quite a massive role in terms of supporting the implementing partners, obviously not on the same program, because there's kind of strict parameters around it, but supporting them with operational costs and so on. And I think also in terms of assisting with cash flow management. And then the other role that corporates can play in that space is through this fund, through these types of funds, it's very easy to crowd into that space with a very low administrative burden coming into that space. I see Stuart's hand is up, I think he's also got to add to this.
Riyad, I just wanted to share the one we were actually hearing about earlier today on a program where Unilever pays for outcomes for a waste picking program in Nigeria. So there's a whole program to support livelihoods through waste picking. And Unilever pays for the outcomes, which is plastic that can be recycled. And Unilever achieves certain of its own sustainability objectives by doing so. And it also is able to monetize that plastic through its recycling. So a really good example of a corporate paying for an outcome that then enables a social program that creates livelihoods around waste picking as an activity. And certainly you can think about how similar things could be done in South Africa.
Great. Thanks very much. There's also a couple of questions around the sort of definitional criteria. So how do you define a job, right? So I think it's really important to be clear that for an outcomes fund, that has to be very specific. So maybe Raj, you can tell us in this example how we define that so that we know exactly what it is that we're measuring.
Sure. And that's actually something that even with us trying to be very, very specific at the start, we actually realized that we needed to be more specific in some cases. In this case, we're looking at jobs that are fully, as I said, fully remunerated by the employing entity. And there's with a specific group of youth. And no, we're not linking up to public sector in any way, so that there isn't that kind of training cost in that being offset by other public sector funding. But even in that, there were a lot of complications because there are, for instance, incentive schemes in some industries and so we've got to navigate around that. And I think as a pilot, one of the big learnings was that we do need to be very, very specific from the start about how we get to those exclusion criteria. And I think moving forward, as we do move ahead with other outcomes funds, there'll be flexibility depending on the funder on certain aspects. But it's whatever that flexibilities are, it's got to be very clearly defined always. And that is a difficult one to get absolutely right, even after the contracting phase. And that, as I said, we've had a few queries where organizations have sort of almost inadvertently ended up in a bit of a loophole with an incentive scheme or something. And so a lot of research does need to be put into the sector or different sectors to understand that.
Thanks, Riyad. Sekho, maybe one for you. You mentioned about sort of the learning group that's been put together. We're getting quite a few questions about people wanting a little bit more detail around the kind of interventions that are being supported and the outcomes that are being achieved. Is there a plan from the presidency side around how to share the learnings from this more broadly with the public?
Thanks, Nicole. So to respond to your first question, there are a couple of instruments in several sectors. We have the ECD, Early Childhood Education, not ECD, instrument that is being led by the Department of Basic Education in conjunction with Education Outcomes Fund. We have the Imagine Social Impact Bond. There's an NGO-run instrument around mental health. And then the city of eThekwini is piloting a homelessness instrument. And so, like I said, the learning group is very much at its nascent stage. And the plans that we have for this group are to identify, as I mentioned, the challenges to institutionalization and scale. And then with the leadership of the presidency, developing a legislative framework for these instruments. I think there will be, there is appetite to share the learnings, of course. I think it's just around the timing of when we'll share those learnings. But there's intention to definitely share learnings and bring other interested organizations along with us on the journey.
No, that's fantastic. And I do think it's a big part of that whole market building effort, right? So I think the beauty of these instruments is that it's collaboration in its true form, right? There's no way we're tackling systemic challenges. There's no one public sector body, no one corporate, no one foundation that's going to be able to address these things on their own. And so this is a great way for different stakeholders to work together, to lean into their strengths and to support each other in the areas where they need that support in order to get things done. I'm conscious that we only have a couple of minutes left until the end of the webinar. I'd like to take the opportunity before I hand over to our panelists for a couple of final thoughts, just to remind everyone that Kudum is actively working in this space and that we have a very collaborative approach. So we're always open to speaking to you, regardless of which stakeholder group you fall into, if you want to learn more about how these funds work or how they might apply to what it is that you're trying to achieve in the impact space. With that, I'd like to open up to a final thought on outcomes funds, whether it's in general on the model or the Jobs Boost Outcome Fund specifically. Thashin, let's start with you. Any final thought that you'd like to share with everyone as we wrap up?
Yeah, I think the final thought is that the outcome fund works from a perspective of we're trying to really find what demand looks like within the space. And so with most of the operators that have signed up, there's a forecast or there are partnership arrangements that have signaled that there is demand. And so they're training for that purpose, but that demand changes over time. And so I think the funding is truly being leveraged in a way that allows us to be able to follow demand in the market. So we want to kind of just leave the folks on the call with that, is that the model allows for a demand-led approach to be impact. I mean, I think we're looking forward to understanding a little bit more about where the jobs are in South Africa. And I think we'll be able to learn that about that post this particular pilot.
Yeah, well, maybe from the public sector perspective, any sort of final thought you'd like to leave with everyone?
Sure, I'll be quick. From our side as the presidency, just to say we really believe in this model. We encourage other government agencies, other government departments to experiment with outcomes-based financing approaches. We are, like I mentioned, starting to plan and think about scale and how we reorient existing funding in the skilling system that we know hasn't been effective and we know doesn't lead to jobs towards this more outcomes-based approach. And so we're very excited, be on the lookout for the scaled up version of Jobs Boost.
Thanks. I think we're all very excited about that. Riyad, especially you, I imagine. Final thought from your side?
I'm just really excited and amazed at the speed of deployment in the space. I think that at the start of the program, if you had to say we'd be reaching 1,000 jobs in 3 months of starting the program, I would have been a total pessimist. And I do think at some point we are going to reach a scale that gets us towards saturation. I think there's a certain number of jobs that can be created in the space in this manner, but I think that this is a fund that gets us a lot closer to that. It's, yeah, I'm amazed, happily amazed at it, and I'm quite excited about how we can scale it further. Thanks.
Oh, fantastic. A lot of optimism and excitement in the room. Stuart, do you want to lean into that with your final thoughts?
Absolutely. Thanks everybody for joining us. It's really great to be able to share this experience, and we're super excited to continue the conversation with many of you. So thanks for being part of it.
Thank you. And thank you very much to everyone who joined us today. Thank you very much to our panelists. And thank you to everyone on the call and behind the scenes who's been working so hard on making this work. There's going to be 5,000 youth that are very grateful for your efforts. So thank you so much. I hope that you guys have learned today. If you have any questions that didn't get a chance to get answered today, or anything further that you'd like to understand about these funds, please do get in touch with the Prism team. We're more than happy to answer any questions. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, everybody. Thank you again.